Imagine waking up one morning, grabbing your coffee, turning on the radio, and learning that a global superpower has placed nuclear missiles just, miles from your country's border.
Yeah, terrifying.
Yeah.
That was the reality for people in October 1962.
Hmm.
And for 13 incredibly tense days, the world basically held its breath.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into Max Hastings' absolutely monumental work, Abyss, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962.
And this isn't just some dry history lesson, folks. Hastings tells a gripping story. It's packed with these larger-than-life characters, some really shocking details, and a countdown that honestly felt like it could have been humanity's last moment.
It really does read like that. Our mission today really is to unpack this crisis. As I was reading Hastings, what jumped out was, well, first, the decades of Cold War tension building up to it.
Right.
Then the personalities involved: Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, very strong figures, and these secret military operations that were going on behind the scenes. So we're hoping you'll get some maybe unexpected insights today, a few aha moments like I had. It really makes you think just how terrifyingly close we came and how thankfully we pulled back.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. The world after World War II. Hastings calls it a bipolar world. You've got this huge ideological fight, capitalism versus communism.
Right, two super energetic empires, as he puts it, both convinced they had this global mission.
Exactly. And this wasn't just talk, it affected everything, all the global politics.
And it wasn't their first clash either. I mean, the Cold War landscape was already kind of littered with these perilous lunges and blunders, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Think about the Berlin blockade back in 48-49.
Or North Korea invading South Korea in 1950.
Hungary in 56, Suez the same year.
Yeah.
Later you get Prague in 68, Afghanistan. It just kept happening, these flashpoints.
Yeah, it was this constant tension, always under that nuclear shadow, which makes what happened in Cuba feel even, well, scarier.
Totally. General Omar Bradley said it way back in 48. We live in an age of nuclear giants and ethical infants.
Wow, that's quite a quote.
Isn't it? And Hastings brings up this really chilling idea of the owls in crisis management.
Owls.
Yeah, the people who think big wars don't usually happen because of some grand evil plan, but because of, malfunctions.
Malfunctions, like technical stuff.
Technical stuff, sure, but also malfunctions of minds, he says. Misperceptions, misunderstandings, simple mistakes.
Malfunctions of minds.
Little.
Yeah, that's powerful. It suggests so much of this was just human error piling up.
Exactly. Not necessarily grand strategy, but misjudgment, which leads us right to Cuba, the pearl in the pond in this whole game.
Right. Historically, the U.S. kind of saw Cuba as its backyard, didn't it? Like a natural appendage, dominated economically, politically.
Pretty much. So when Fidel Castro comes along in 59, very anti-American, starts taking over U.S.-owned businesses, a lot of Cubans saw that as, finally reclaiming their country.
But for the U.S., big problem. Eisenhower apparently decided he had to dispose of this noisy, tiresome Latino gadfly. There were even calls for Castro's elimination.
Strong words. And all that antagonism really boiled over with the Bay of Pigs in April 61.
Ah, yes, the Bay of Pigs, a total fiasco, especially for the brand new Kennedy administration.
Massive blunder. Kennedy basically inherited this CIA plan to use Cuban exiles, Brigade 2506, to invade, pushed hard by Allen Dulles of the CIA.
And the U.S. military brass seemed weirdly confident, didn't they? Hastings mentions their sort of contempt for Castro's army.
Yeah, total hubris. They were super enthusiastic about the exiles, even though Kennedy had already said, look, no direct U.S. military help.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster right there.
And it was a swift, brutal failure. The U.S. air support everyone expected never showed up. The exiles had to surrender.
How did that leave Washington looking?
Like, quote, fools to our friends, rascals to our enemies, and pretty incompetent to everyone else. Yeah. And after that, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, really stepped in. He took the lead in Cuban policy, pushed for a showdown, even oversaw this thing called Operation Mongoose.
Mongoose? What was that?
Basically a covert operation to try and overthrow Castro. Sabotage, propaganda, all sorts of stuff. It shows how personal this whole thing became for the Kennedys. Really emotional.
Okay, so that's the U.S. side heating up. What about the Soviets? Mother Russia, as Hastings puts it. They had successes, but also problems, right?
Big time. On one hand, Yeah, massive propaganda wins. Sputnik in 57, Yuri Gagarin becoming the first man in space in 61.
Huge. Made it look like they were way ahead technologically, maybe even capable of hitting the U.S. with nukes from
That
space.
was the image, yeah. But Hastings reveals the reality, especially of Gagarin's flight, was much more rickety, rackety, mortally dangerous.
Yeah.
They kept that secret for decades.
So behind the curtain.
Behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Pretty grim picture. Bad harvests, food prices shooting up like 20–30% for meat and butter in 62. Industry wasn't keeping up. Chronic shortages of basic goods.
Hastings has that stark comparison, right? The coal miner thing.
Yeah, an American miner dug out 14 tons a day. The Soviet miner just over 2. That tells you a lot about the economic reality versus the space race hype.
So into this mix steps Nikita Khrushchev. What's Hastings' take on him? He seems like a really complex character.
Oh, absolutely. Born poor, working from age 12, Hastings calls him fiercely ambitious and materialistic, and he survived Stalin's purges, rising through, quote, a mountain of corpses.
Doesn't sound like someone to mess with.
Not at all. Hugh Gaitskell, the British labor leader, had this amazing description. A rather agreeable pig.
An agreeable pig? How can you be both?
Right. Shows the contradictions.
Yeah.
He was often underestimated, but known for, well, duplicity and equivocation, bluff and persiflage. Fancy word for BS, basically.
And he acted alone a lot.
Yeah, didn't seem to care much about consulting others. And his policies could be really unpredictable. Like with artists and writers, he goes after Pasternak for the Nobel Prize.
Right. Forced him to turn it down.
But then he approves Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, this really critical book about the gulags. It's baffling.
And he liked to rattle the saber, didn't he? Threaten nuclear wars.
Constantly. Told the UK they had several score of bombs earmarked for them. Part of that was probably playing to the hardliners back in the Kremlin, always needing to look tough. Vulnerable, maybe?
So this constant need to project strength, maybe covering up insecurities or oppression from his own government?
Could be. Hastings suggests exactly that. Vulnerability to hardliners. And Berlin was always a sore spot, a place he kept poking.
Because people were escaping East Germany through West Berlin.
Exactly. It was this channel, as Moscow saw it, for Ostist East Germans to flee to the west. Khrushchev kept stirring up crises over Berlin, even though Hastings thinks he never actually planned to use force there. It was a strategic blunder, just keeping everyone on edge.
Okay, so that's the Soviet side. Now, America. Power, sure, but also deep problems at home.
Yeah, the Cold War anxiety was huge. Gallup polls showed keeping the peace or dealing with the Russians was the #1 worry for Americans.
And the missile gap thing was big then, right? The idea that Soviets had way more missiles.
Huge myth, but widely believed. Fueled by journalists like Joseph Elsop, based on claims from guys like General Thomas Power at Strategic Air Command, led to this massive U.S. arms buildup, all based on, well, bad info.
But the biggest domestic issue.
Oh, race. Hastings calls it a poison seeping through the veins of American society. Just horrific stuff happening. Fannie Lou Hamer's persecution, the violence against the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King fighting back with nonviolence. It's crucial context for what the Kennedy administration was juggling.
Speaking of the administration, Hastings calls them densely peopled by the brilliant, the best and the brightest.
That was the image. JFK himself, huge charisma, hunger for greatness, but also apparently inherited this profound ruthlessness from his father.
Yeah.
Maybe more focused on the global stage than problems at home, at least initially. He came to civil rights pretty late.
And his defense secretary, Robert McNamara.
Ah, McNamara, the technocrat. Seen as this skeptical, resented political overlords by the military brass, he famously believed war was too important to be left just to the generals.
Which led to SIOP 63, that nuclear war plan.
Exactly. The single integrated operational plan. His attempt to bring logic to the unthinkable, planning for graduated escalation instead of just all-out annihilation, tried to control the uncontrollable, maybe.
Then you had Dean Rusk at State, the cautious work.
Very cautious, yeah. Instinctively unwilling to stick his neck out. A real Cold Warrior, saw China as just plain wicked.
And George Bundy, National Security Advisor, the smartest of the smart.
Yep, seen as brilliant, a natural high functionary.
Yeah.
But maybe, Hastings suggests, his understanding of other cultures was a bit lacking. Meager is the word used.
Okay, and RFK Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, he gets some harsh descriptions. Brother's hitman, licensed thug.
Yeah, he had that reputation as a tough enforcer.
Yeah.
But Hastings also credits him with common sense, terrific energy, and crucially, being willing to change his mind. That turns out to be incredibly important.
And finally, the military leaders, the Joint Chiefs, guys who'd won World War II.
Right. And they had real contempt for communist forces. General Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command, infamous for wanting to bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age, proud of fearing defeat much more than war. These were not guys inclined towards backing down.
Wow, what a volatile mix of personalities and pressures on all sides.
Truly. And into this powder keg, Khrushchev throws his match. Operation Antidote. The Red Gambit.
Deploying missiles in Cuba. Hastings calls it a classic Khrushchev move, right? Like that Napoleon quote.
Exactly. On s'engage et puis on voit. You jump in, then figure it out. Reflects Khrushchev's opportunist style, taking these huge, dangerous gambles.
So why? Why take such a massive risk? What were his motivations?
It was layered. Defending Cuba, definitely. He saw it as this Soviet avant-post, a bridgehead in America's sphere, and believed a U.S. invasion was inevitable after the Bay of Pigs.
Okay, defense makes sense.
What else? Projecting Soviet power, showing strength on the global stage.
Yeah.
Also, counterbalancing those American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey, right on the Soviet border.
Ah, the Turkey missiles, that's key.
Very key. Plus, internal stuff, issues within the Cuban Communist Party, and constant taunts from China that Moscow was going soft, capitulating to imperialism.
And fundamentally trying to fix the actual nuclear imbalance.
Precisely. His big intercontinental missiles, the R-16s, were liquid-fueled, took hours to get ready, very vulnerable to a U.S. first strike. America's Minuteman missiles were solid-fueled, much faster.
So his ICBMs were basically only good for a first strike themselves.
Pretty much. By putting shorter-range missiles, medium and intermediate, right there in Cuba, he could suddenly hit the U.S. quickly. It would, as he saw it, equalize the balance of power almost overnight, make the Americans feel vulnerable, like the Soviets did.
It was an incredibly bold move, and the scale of the deployment was huge, wasn't it?
Massive. Hastings says the plan was for over 50,000 Soviet troops eventually, 5 missile regiments, plus a naval force cruisers, destroyers, those little Komar missile boats, and 11 submarines.
And Khrushchev thought the subs were nuclear-powered.
Yeah, mistakenly.
Yeah.
Which just adds another layer of potential misunderstanding to the whole thing.
And the journey itself was dangerous. The ships carrying the missiles.
Very. Some carried hydrogen peroxide, which is super volatile. Could have exploded in rough seas. And once the troops got to Cuba, not exactly paradise.
Yeah.
Hastings paints a picture of plagues of insects, dysentery, communication problems because nobody spoke the same language. One poor signal guy was apparently terrified of black widow spiders.
You forget the human element in these big geopolitical dramas.
Right. And one specialist actually learned the launch code for missiles aimed at Scotland. Probably the Fast Lane Naval Base. Just sitting there in Cuba with that knowledge. Incredible.
Yet, despite all the secrecy getting there, Hastings points out this massive blunder once they arrived.
Yes. The typically Russian mistake, as one official apparently called it. All this effort to ship them secretly, and then no attempt was made to conceal them on the island.
Seriously, why?
Seems like speed was the priority. Just get them there fast. Too many ships, too visible. Castro himself later said they could have disguised them, maybe as agricultural projects or something.
Hindsight is 20/20, I guess. The irony is pretty thick, though.
Isn't it? Now, from the Cuban side, Castro actually agreeing to host the missiles. That surprised the Russians.
Why?
It just seemed incredibly risky. But Hastings puts it down to Castro being a lifelong risk taker, maybe caught up in this sense of Cuban exceptionalism, this national defiance. He saw it as helping the global socialist cause and sticking it to the U.S.
But how did ordinary Cubans feel? It must have been unsettling, at least.
Definitely mixed feelings. Some people, like one source Hastings quotes, Jose Ballara, felt crises brought people together, this spontaneous enthusiasm, unity against the enemy.
But others, not so much.
Others, like Margarita Alducin, were worried about the revolution turning fully communist, dealing with food shortages, rationing. One kid, Maximo Gomez, just got pulled out of school to go cut sugarcane. Life was disrupted.
And there was that machismo element, too.
Yeah, architecture student Jose Ferrara mentioned that typical Cuban machismo, people boasting we could finish off the United States. But at the same time, he said there were very dark days, suddenly seeing shelter here, signs everywhere. A weird mix of bravado and deep fear.
Which brings us perfectly to the moment the U.S. finds out. The shock of discovery. How did the U.S., with all its spies and satellites, miss this for so long? Hastings calls it a near-total intelligence surprise.
It's baffling, right? The President's own intelligence board later called it a malfunction of the analytic process. They just didn't connect the dots or didn't want to believe it.
But there were warnings, weren't there?
There were. Juanita Moody at the NSA, head of the Cuba desk, noticed the Cubans getting much better at communication security, thanks to the Russians. She said she started really getting scared early in 1962.
And the CIA director, John McCone.
McConey gave Kennedy 4 specific warnings between August 10th and 23rd. He personally believed strategic missiles were coming, but Rusk and McNamara mostly dismissed him.
Why? Why dismiss the CIA director?
Partly because McConey had previously suggested this kind of crazy idea about faking a Cuban attack on Guantanamo Bay as an excuse to invade. It hurt his credibility, unfortunately.
So the warnings were there, but ignored, until the U-2 flights.
Right. The U-2 spy planes have been getting incredible photos for years. Flights over Cuba were limited, though, partly politics, partly weather. But on October 14, 1962, Major Richard Heiser got the money shot.
What did he see?
He saw launch sites being built. And the shapes, the equipment, they matched the photos of Soviet SS-4 medium-range missiles from the May Day parades in Moscow.
The SS-4s? Those are the ones that could hit.
Cincinnati, Houston, Washington, D.C., major U.S. cities. Suddenly, the threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It was right there, 90 miles away.
And there was another crucial intelligence source, wasn't there, Penkovsky?
Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer, GRU, who was spying for the West, an incredibly important double agent.
What did he provide?
Thousands of pages of documents on microfilm, including the actual manuals for the SS-4 and the longer-range SS-5 missiles. His info completely changed the game.
How so?
It showed the West that the Soviet nuclear arsenal wasn't nearly as big or advanced as Khrushchev had been bragging. The missile gap was largely a myth, favoring the U.S. This gave Kennedy and his team a bit more confidence, knowing they weren't actually behind.
So the photos come in, Penkovsky's intel confirms the missile types. What was the immediate reaction in the White House?
Just shock and anger, Hastings writes. They felt totally blindsided and, frankly, lied to by the Soviets. Khrushchev looked like he was trying to make a simpleton of Kennedy, a direct challenge in their own backyard.
And all this time, Operation Mongoose, that weird anti-Castro thing, was still happening.
Hilariously, yes. Run by Colonel Edward Lansdale, an ex-advertising guy, apparently, and Bill Harvey, who had problems with alcohol. They were doing things like trying to recruit mafia bosses to assassinate Castro.
You can't make this stuff up.
Right. Hastings calls them absolutely pointless sabotage operations that only increased Castro's popularity. The contrast between these almost keystone cops' efforts and the deadly serious missile threat is just stark.
It really is. Which leads us into those incredibly tense 13 days, the crucible, as Hastings calls it, starting October 16th with the ExComm meetings.
ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This was Kennedy's hand-picked group of advisors meeting in secret once those photos were confirmed.
Who was in the room?
The core group was Kennedy, McNamara, Rusk, Bundy, Robert Kennedy, General Taylor, Treasury Secretary Dillon, CIA Director McConey, George Ball, VP Lyndon Johnson was there too, though apparently played a pretty marginal role.
Unlike Truman being kept in the dark about the atomic bomb, Johnson was at least included.
Right, and the initial debate was fierce. What do we do?
What were the main options on the table?
Basically, 2 camps emerged pretty quickly. Option 1, hit them hard, hit them fast, an immediate airstrike to take out the missiles, maybe followed by an invasion. That was the military view, mostly.
Hawks.
Definitely the Hawks. The Joint Chiefs, Taylor, LeMay, others were unanimous. Bomb Cuba, then invade. Hastings notes they never really regretted pushing for war, feeling they missed a chance for a decisive victory.
LeMay especially sounded eager for action.
Oh yeah, he dismissed the anti-nuclear intellectuals, argued for striking hard. His attitude was very much, let's get this over with.
And the other option?
Diplomacy. Slow down, talk, use pressure. That was more Dean Rusk's initial position. Try to negotiate a withdrawal.
So hawks versus doves, essentially. How did Kennedy navigate that? He must have felt immense pressure from the military.
Tremendous pressure. But you see caution from the civilians. Kennedy himself, Hastings says, showed this deep and controlled anger at being deceived. But he also questioned the whole premise, whoever believed in the missile gap, he asked.
Your question?
McNamara wanted to know for sure where the nuclear warheads actually were before any strike. And George Ball made that powerful point about morality.
The Pearl Harbor comparison.
Exactly. A strike without warning is like Pearl Harbor. It's the kind of conduct one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States. That really hit home for some.
And looming over all of this was the Berlin question, right? What happens in Europe if the U.S. attacks Cuba?
Huge concern. Many worried the Soviets would just grab West Berlin in response, trade Cuba for Berlin. When General Taylor was asked, okay, we bombed Cuba, they take Berlin, what next? His answer was basically, go to general war, nuclear exchange. Just like that.
Chillingly casual.
Right. And Kennedy's response to that is crucial. He says, now the question really is to what action we take, which lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure. His focus was squarely on avoiding Armageddon.
So bombing was too risky, pure diplomacy maybe too slow. What did they land on?
The middle ground.
Yeah.
A naval blockade. Though they decided to call it a quarantine legally to make it sound less like an act of war.
A quarantine. Who suggested that phrasing?
It emerged from the discussions,
Yeah.
and the British ambassador, David Ormsby Gore, a close friend of Kennedy's, apparently suggested setting the blockade line 500 miles out from Cuba
Why so far out?
to buy time. Give Soviet ships more time to stop, give diplomats more hours to talk before any confrontation happened right off the Cuban coast. Smart tactical suggestion.
And this decision led to that famous confrontation between McNamara and the Navy chief.
Yeah, Admiral George Anderson. McNamara basically read him the riot act, making it crystal clear that no shots would be fired without explicit permission from the civilian leadership.
Shooting without my permission, I think was the phrase.
That's the one. It was this critical moment, Hastings emphasizes, of civilian control asserting itself over the military's desire to, well, run the show. The president, not the admirals, would decide on war or peace.
So the decision is made, quarantine. How did the rest of the world react, particularly allies like the UK?
Well, the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was absolutely terrified. Desperately fearful, Hastings says. He worried the White House was overreacting, maybe stumbling into war through miscalculation, just like he believed happened in 1914.
And did other allies share that fear? Did they understand the American position?
Privately, many found the American obsession with Cuba a bit much. Hastings notes a general lack of sympathy among some allies. In Britain, lots of academics, public figures, they were skeptical.
Like Bertrand Russell.
Yeah, the famous philosopher. He sent these fawning cables to Khrushchev, basically blaming Kennedy, calling his actions desperate. Many Brits saw Castro as just trying to break free from American influence and thought Britain should stay neutral.
What about other Europeans? They lived with Soviet missiles pointed at them constantly.
That's a key point Hastings makes. Europeans were looking at maybe 500 Soviet missiles aimed at them. So the fuss over 20 or 30 in Cuba seemed, well, ironical, as he puts it. A bit of a welcome to the club feeling, perhaps.
And even Allied intelligence wasn't fully on board.
It seems not entirely. Hastings mentions British intelligence officers in Washington who were apparently oblivious to how serious the U.S. was taking it. They were still arguing the Soviets would never put missiles in Cuba because it would risk their position in Europe. Shows how compartmentalized information was.
So the world is watching. Allies are nervous. What happens when Kennedy tells the American public? That address on October 22nd.
That's when it really hit home for ordinary people. Panic. Hastings mentions reports of panic buying in supermarkets. Sergei Khrushchev, the son, said the reaction reminded him of Pearl Harbor, a real sense of national crisis.
And this fear wasn't just in the U.S., right?
No, it was global. Hastings quotes ordinary people. A kid in Brooklyn thinking the world was ending. A soldier, Major Bill Smith, saying he was scared to death. Bob Dylan wondering if he'd live to write another song. That level of anxiety.
What about inside the Soviet Union? Did people there know what was going on?
It was more confusing for them. Some, like Nikolai Kozakov Hastings mentions, heard about the missiles from Voice of America and actually felt sympathy for the U.S. Like, who would want missiles 90 miles away?
Interesting reaction.
Others were more defiant or perhaps just numb. A teenager, Tamara Kosik, felt Russians couldn't be that scared after surviving World War II. An 18-year-old, Valery Galenkov, thought Khrushchev was right to stand up to the Americans. So a mix, but probably less immediate panic than in the U.S.
Okay, so the quarantine is in place. The world is terrified. Did things start to escalate? Were there close calls?
Oh, yes. There were moments of restraint. The U.S. let that Soviet oil tanker, the Bucharest, sail through the quarantine line, a signal they weren't trying to strangle Cuba completely, just stop the weapons.
But then the U-2 was shot down. October 27th. That must have been a huge shock.
Massive escalation. Major Rudolph Anderson was killed. The XCOM group in Washington was stunned. They assumed it must have been ordered directly by Moscow, a deliberate provocation.
But it wasn't.
Hastings says the evidence suggests it was a local Soviet commander acting on his own, or possibly Cubans firing the SAM missile. There wasn't that coherence in intent, Washington assumed, just more fog of war, more potential for accidental escalation.
And then there was the submarine incident. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Terrifying. U.S. destroyers were dropping practice depth charges near Soviet Foxtrot submarines, trying to force them to surface for identification.
Practice depth charges.
Yeah,
Near a sub that might have nuclear weapons.
exactly. And these subs were apparently hellholes. Cramped, boiling hot, like 65 degrees Celsius. Hastings sees water rationing, foul air. Just imagine the stress.
Unbearable.
So on one sub, the B-59, the captain, Savitsky, thought they were under real attack. He ordered them to prepare a nuclear torpedo.
A nuclear torpedo.
Yeah, 10 kilotons, more than half the power of the Hiroshima bomb. His quote was apparently, "We'll die and drown everyone, but we won't disgrace the fleet."
My God, what stopped him?
Thankfully, his second-in-command and the political officer on board argued him down. They refused to authorize the launch without orders from Moscow. But it shows how close we came. A single stressed-out submarine captain could have started World War III.
Hastings makes that point right, about subordinate officers having control.
Yes, that some subordinate officers enjoyed a control over the use of weapons of mass destruction, which could have unleashed a catastrophe unintended by either the Kremlin or the White House. And compounding all this was the communication problem.
Oh, so?
It just took forever for messages to get back and forth between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Hours. Using official channels, telexes, translation, Hastings calls it a snail-like pace. In a fast-moving nuclear crisis, that's incredibly dangerous. Misunderstandings festered.
It's amazing things didn't spiral completely out of control. Which brings us to the brink and then the retreat. How did it finally get resolved?
Well, Khrushchev started sending messages, but they were confusingly different. On October 26th, a long, rambling, emotional private letter arrives, basically saying, "Let's not destroy the world. I'll take the missiles out if you promise not to invade Cuba."
Okay, that sounds like a potential deal.
It did. But then, the next day, October 27th, the same day the U-2 was shot down, Radio Moscow broadcasts a public message from Khrushchev. This one adds a new condition. "We'll take our missiles out of Cuba if you take your Jupiter missiles out of Turkey."
Ah, the Turkey missiles again. How did XCOM react to that?
They were dismayed. It looked like Khrushchev was upping the ante, making it harder. But some, including Kennedy himself, actually saw it as a reasonable trade, a possible way out. Hastings notes Kennedy was personally minded to accede to it.
And complicating things even more was Castro, right? His letter to Khrushchev.
Yes, also on that incredibly tense Saturday, October 27th, Castro sends a message that sounded, to the Russians at least, like he was urging Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the U.S. if an invasion of Cuba began.
A preemptive strike.
That's how Khrushchev apparently read it. He later wrote that when they got Castro's message, the Soviet leadership just sat there in silence, looking at each other for a long time. Imagine receiving that.
Unbelievable. So how did Kennedy cut through all this confusion and escalation?
They decided to, essentially, ignore the second public letter with the Turkey demand and respond only to the first private letter, the Turkey for Cuba deal, as it became known.
So formally accept the first offer.
Right. Robert Kennedy was sent to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin. RFK delivered the message. The U.S. publicly promises not to invade Cuba if the Soviet missiles are withdrawn under UN supervision.
And the Turkey missiles, was that part of the deal?
Implicitly, yes. RFK apparently told Dobrinin privately that the U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey were obsolete anyway and would be removed soon, but it couldn't be announced publicly as part of this deal. It had to be kept secret, so it didn't look like a direct trade, which would have angered NATO allies, especially Turkey.
A secret sweetener, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it worked. The next day, Sunday, October 28th, Khrushchev went on Radio Moscow and announced they were dismantling the missiles in Cuba. He cited Kennedy's statesmanship, his understanding of the responsibility. The crisis was over.
Wow, just like that. But how did the Soviets on the ground feel humiliated?
Very much so, according to Hastings. They felt let down, forced into a retreat. They hated the shameful inspection of our ships by the Americans as they left. They had to leave from deserted piers with no traditional farewells, a real blow to their pride.
And one concrete outcome was the hotline, right?
Yes, the famous red phone, though it was actually a teletype machine, installed the following year, a direct link between the Pentagon and the Kremlin, precisely to avoid that snail-like pace of communication that had made the crisis so much more dangerous.
So looking back at this whole terrifying episode, what does Hastings think it all means for us today? What are the big takeaways?
Well, the most obvious one is just how frighteningly close we came to annihilation. Relief, sure that the world was still there, as Hastings puts it. But it exposed some really deep vulnerabilities.
Like what?
like the fog of ignorance leaders operate in during crises, the sheer fallibility of giant state information gathering machines, the intelligence failures on both sides, and just the incredibly reckless proposals being thrown around, especially by some military figures.
Timeless problems, really.
Absolutely. But lessons were learned too. The crisis definitely reinforced the idea of nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, but also the absolute necessity of communication. Clear, fast communication.
And the role of leadership. Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Hastings argues that for all their flaws, both Kennedy and Khrushchev were ultimately prudently haunted by consequences. They understood the finality of nuclear war in a way that maybe some of their advisors, or even Castro, didn't seem to grasp quite as acutely.
So sometimes winning means knowing when to stop, when to step back.
Precisely. Kennedy could have pushed harder, maybe listened to the Hawks, especially after the U-2 was shot down. He had, as Hastings says, every possible justification from a purely military standpoint, but he held back. He accepted a compromise. That was crucial.
Hastings ends on a pretty sobering note, though, doesn't he? Saying the world got lucky in '62.
He does, and he draws that chilling parallel to today, mentioning the angry and half-deranged autocrat who tenants the Kremlin in 2022, suggesting this risk of nuclear conflict, which faded into the background for decades, is now back.
Which really leads to our final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed today, the personalities, the pressures, the technology, the sheer luck involved in 1962, what stands out to you? How might those same factors play out, or play out differently, in a future global crisis? Do the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis still hold? How does understanding this deep dive into the abyss shape how you view the geopolitical tensions we see right now?